We come to Paris today with a heavy heart, but with hope. We come to Paris today not to reinforce the divisions of the past, the orders of the past, but we come to Paris to identify the common humanity that we share and the absolute moral imperative to save our planet and to make it livable. We don't need a lot more words today. And quite honestly, I don't know that I have it in me to give more words. As I speak to you, my country, that of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and others in the Caribbean, in the Eastern Caribbean, are under a tropical storm watch for Tropical Storm Beth, literally. Yesterday, I had to decide whether to stay or to go. And I chose to stay because it is important that we move to action. Behind Tropical Storm Beth is another system. And hence, this is our new reality. We have heard this morning from Vanessa. We've heard from the economists. We've heard from the president of Niger. And everyone has spoken truth with feeling, with clarity. And Emmanuel, I've left you for last because privately I call this the How Dare You Summit. How dare you? How dare you upset the order? How dare you step out of your crease and summon us all to this inflection moment that will determine whether we will have the capacity and the will to bring pace and scope to the problem. I can tell you that there has been movement. Yes, 9 months ago, no one was speaking about natural disaster clauses. Now we have people wanting to recognize the wisdom of it because countries do need to pause debt payments if they are going to house and feed people who are victims of a climate crisis. Doesn't quite work as well for those who have to move people who are suffering from drought, as the president of Malawi has had to do. So we need to perfect it. 9 months ago, no one was talking about multilateral development bank reform at scale. And Ajay, the World Bank was not as forceful in its commitment to the crisis of climate as it is now. And we wish you all the best because in your hands lies the need for pace and scope. 9 months ago, we were not prepared to discuss issues of debt. And Kristalina, when no one else was stepping up during the pandemic, yes, you led the way, recognizing that your duty was not only to deal with the symptoms of the balance of payments problems, but to go back to the treaty and its underlying objective of securing growth and macro and financial and economic stability. But what is required of us is not simply to mark a card for progress. As we heard from Vanessa, what is required of us now is absolute transformation and not reform of our institutions. And that transformation is required because while the world knew since the 1890s that we were facing the warming of the climate, We chose not to heed the advice of scientists. And that which could have been done in more than a century is now being reduced to be done in less than a decade. And Secretary General, my heart bleeds for you, because yours has been almost that constant voice in the wilderness. But I say to you that it has not been in vain. As you heard from President Macron this morning, there is now the beginning of the understanding that poverty and climate cannot be separated. That education and climate cannot be separated. And later today we will go into the details of what that action must look like, much of which we have put in the Bridgetown Initiative, not because we believe we have the answers alone, but simply because we had the will to pull people together and say, let us discuss these issues and let us make enough noise consistently to command the attention of those who must speak and who must act. I ask us today not to leave Paris without understanding that the bolstering of the political ambition that is required must secure transformation and not reform. And I ask us to ensure that those of us who are heads of government and heads of state recognize that the world cannot continue in the shadow of an old imperial order that does not see countries, does not feel countries, does not hear countries, and worse, does not see, feel, or hear people. I ask us today to recognize that we cannot come to Paris but let our directors go back to the IMF or the World Bank and it be business as usual. They do not act in their own interests. They act on behalf of our sovereign states. And that is why we speak not only to the need for money, we speak to the need for the reform of the governance systems. Because when these institutions were founded, our countries did not exist. And we speak for a complete transformation of securing the sources of capital, as unpopular as it might be to voice it. We do not ask for the bankruptcy of private companies. That's not our wish. But we do ask for everybody to share the burden so that we can share the bounty. And it therefore means that simply relying and holding only governments accountable has run its course. And what is necessary now is for us to bring to the table also multinational corporations whose balance sheets dwarf more than 2/3 of the world's states. That is the world we have created out of the last century. And if we don't recognize that they cannot be left out of the equation, I'm coming. If they don't recognize that they cannot be left out of the equation, then we have no desire to solve the problem. And we thank philanthropy for what they do, but it can't only be what they like. It has to be what the world needs. And I hope that we leave Paris, therefore, not only secure in our determination to protect the planet, to protect the biodiversity, to protect people, but to recognize that if we do not act today at scale, with pace, we will not be able to get there in time to save more people. Let us, as the representatives of our people, at this most unique time in the history of civilization, not only do the right thing, but do it in time and do it for the right reasons. We will have more time in the next day and a half to discuss the details. But my plea simply now is to step up the pace and let's get going.
Regrettably, there are too many people dying in conflict, as a result of the economic crisis, And the hand that we must lend to life comes in the decisions that we must make to reform and to fight for peace, not to fight to sustain war, wherever it is found across this world. To fight for reform so that our citizens are not made victims of poverty because of the triple crisis of climate, of pandemic, and indeed now of the conflict that is leading to the inflationary pressures that leads, regrettably, to people taking circumstances into their own hand.
On the lack of reform of the United Nations Security Council.
Earlier this week, President Biden spoke of the need to reform the Security Council. We call and echo for that, but we go further because we believe that a Security Council that retains the power of veto in the hands of a few will still lead us to war, as we have seen this year. And therefore, the reform must not simply be in its composition, but also be in the removal of that veto.
As Motley called for international financial institutions and the private sector to do more to support development towards ending poverty, which is goal 1 of the SDGs, while calling for a global compact on long-term financing.
But I want to simply say that if companies, multinational companies, have contributed to the global public risk or benefit from the solutions for global public goods, then they ought to contribute to their resolution through a percentage, a small percentage of their profits, funding the needs of countries, whether it is in the issue of climate, stability and resilience and adaptation, whether it is for the protection of biodiversity both on land and in our waters, whether it is for the protection of public health against the next.
Mia Motley is a force. As the Prime Minister of Barbados, she has become a powerful voice for the developing world. In 2021, she delivered a speech that shook the world. "How dare you," she asked, challenging global leaders on climate change. Her words were a siren call, a desperate plea for justice. Motley spoke not just for Barbados, but for all vulnerable nations. She spoke for the islands sinking beneath rising seas. She spoke for the communities ravaged by storms. She spoke for a world on the brink. Motley's speech was a turning point. She exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of global climate negotiations. Rich nations, she argued, were failing to keep their promises. They were not delivering on climate finance. They were not cutting emissions fast enough, and they were not listening to the voices of those most affected. Climate change is not an abstract threat. It is a lived reality for millions around the world, and it is hitting small island developing states like Barbados the hardest. These nations are on the front lines of the climate crisis. They are facing rising sea levels, more intense hurricanes, and prolonged droughts. The Caribbean, in particular, is highly susceptible to climate change impacts. The region is warming faster than the global average. This means more extreme weather events. Hurricanes Maria and Dorian offered a bitter taste of what's to come. They left a trail of devastation across the Caribbean, wiping out homes, businesses, and entire livelihoods. The human cost was immeasurable. As if climate change wasn't enough, many Caribbean nations are also grappling with crippling debt. This debt trap is a legacy of colonialism and unfair trade practices. It has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Tourism, a vital source of income for many islands, ground to a halt. Economies were shattered. This debt burden makes it nearly impossible for these countries to invest in climate resilience. They are forced to divert scarce resources to debt repayment. This leaves them even more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. It's a vicious cycle. The global financial system is broken. It is rigged against developing countries. International financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank often impose harsh loan conditions. These conditions can stifle economic growth and prevent investment in essential services, including climate adaptation. Motley has called for a major overhaul of the global financial architecture. She wants to see a system that is fair and equitable. A system that supports developing countries in their efforts to build resilience and transition to clean energy. Her Bridgetown initiative, a plan to reform global finance, is gaining traction. It's a sign that the world is finally starting to listen. Caribbean islands, jewels of the sea, bear the scars of history. For centuries, European powers ruled, exploiting the land and its people. They carved out plantations, reaping sugar and spices, but sowing division. African slaves brought in chains, toiled under the whip. Indigenous communities were pushed aside, their voices silenced. This colonial legacy still haunts the Caribbean today. The political systems inherited from a bygone era struggle to serve the people. The divisions of the past, rich and poor, black and white, remain. Trust in government is low, corruption festers, and the Caribbean, once a pawn in the games of empires, faces a new threat: climate change. The Caribbean, a chain of islands strung between two continents, has always been at the mercy of the sea. Hurricanes, those fierce children of the ocean, have long lashed the shores, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. But now the sea itself is rising and gnawing at the edges of these island nations. The Caribbean, a region of vibrant cultures and warm smiles, is facing a defining moment. Can it overcome the ghosts of the past, heal the wounds of history, and face the future together? The answer lies in the hands of its people and the choices they make. Independence came to the Caribbean island by island like the slow roll of a wave upon the shore. Jamaica, with its reggae rhythms and spirit of defiance, threw off the shackles of British rule. Other islands followed, raising their own flags, singing their own anthems of freedom. But freedom, once won, proved a fragile thing. The old divisions, sown deep in the soil of colonialism, lingered. Political parties, often drawing their support along racial or economic lines, battled for power. Corruption, like a weed, took root, choking the dreams of a better future. Some islands, like Cuba, turned to socialism, seeking a fairer society. Others embraced capitalism, hoping to attract foreign investment and lift their people out of poverty. But progress was uneven. Economic growth for some came at the expense of the environment and the most vulnerable. The Caribbean, a tapestry of languages and traditions, yearns for unity, but the path is fraught with obstacles. Can these island nations, scattered like emeralds across the sea, find common ground, build bridges of understanding, and face the challenges of the 21st century together? The Caribbean sun, once a source of life and warmth, now beats down with a fiercer intensity. The air, once sweet with the scent of salt and sea grapes, grows heavy with humidity. The rains, once a welcome respite, now fall with the fury of 1,000 drums, flooding homes and washing away livelihoods. Climate change, a distant threat to some, is a present reality for the Caribbean. Rising sea levels nibble at the shores, swallowing beaches and threatening coastal communities. Hurricanes, once infrequent visitors, now roar with terrifying regularity, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives and broken dreams. The Caribbean, a region dependent on tourism and agriculture, faces an existential threat. Coral reefs, those underwater gardens, bleach and die in the warming waters. Crops wither in the fields as droughts become more frequent and severe. The very future of these island nations, once paradises of sun and sand, is in jeopardy. The Caribbean, a region known for its resilience and spirit, cannot face this challenge alone. The world, particularly those who have contributed the most to climate change, must step up and help these vulnerable islands adapt and survive. The time for action is now, before it is too late. Faced with the mounting crisis of climate change, the political systems of the Caribbean often seem paralyzed, like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming car. Decades of corruption and mismanagement have hollowed out institutions, leaving them ill-equipped to deal with this new threat. Governments, often short-sighted and focused on the next election, struggle to develop long-term plans for climate adaptation and mitigation. The money, when it does come, often disappears into a black hole of bureaucracy or ends up lining the pockets of corrupt officials. The people, meanwhile, grow increasingly frustrated with the lack of action. They see their homes flooded, their crops destroyed, their livelihoods washed away. And they see their leaders, often living in luxury and comfort, seemingly oblivious to their plight. The Caribbean, a region of immense potential, needs a new kind of politics, one that is transparent, accountable, and responsive to the needs of the people. It needs leaders who are willing to put aside short-term gain for the long-term good of their nations and the planet. Section 5. Islands divided. The Caribbean, a region forged in the crucible of colonialism, bears the scars of division. Slavery, that original sin, cast a long shadow, separating people along lines of race and class. Even after emancipation, the legacy of inequality persisted, fueling resentment and distrust. Political parties, often exploiting these divisions for their own gain, play one group against another. Ethnic tensions simmer beneath the surface, occasionally erupting in violence. The dream of a united Caribbean where people of all backgrounds can live together in harmony remains elusive. In Jamaica, the ghosts of the past haunt the present. Political violence, a dark stain on the nation's history, still rears its ugly head. Gangs, often affiliated with political parties, rule some communities with an iron fist, terrorizing residents and perpetuating a cycle of violence. The Caribbean, a region known for its music, its food, and its joyous spirit, deserves better. It deserves leaders who will work to heal the wounds of the past, bridge the divides of race and class, and build a future where all can prosper. Section 6. The shadow of violence. The Caribbean sun, which once nurtured life and brought joy, now casts a long shadow of violence across many islands. Gangs, fueled by poverty, inequality, and the drug trade, hold sway in marginalized communities, their grip tightening like a vice. Young men, often with few opportunities and little hope, are drawn into this world of crime and violence. They see it as a way to escape poverty, to gain respect, to belong. But the path they choose is a dead end, leading only to prison or an early grave. The violence spills out onto the streets, claiming innocent lives and shattering the peace. Tourists, once drawn to the Caribbean for its beauty and tranquility, now think twice before visiting, fearing for their safety. The Caribbean, a region that prides itself on its warmth and hospitality, must break this cycle of violence. It must address the root causes, poverty, inequality, and the lack of opportunities for its youth. It must offer hope, not despair, to its young people, so they can build a better future for themselves and their communities. Section 7. A vicious circle. Climate change and social insecurity form a vicious circle in the Caribbean, each feeding off the other. As the planet warms and the seas rise, natural disasters become more frequent and severe, pushing vulnerable communities further into poverty. Hurricanes and floods destroy homes, crops, and infrastructure, wiping away years of development gains. Tourism, a mainstay of many Caribbean economies, suffers as visitors stay away, fearing the next big storm. Jobs are lost, incomes dwindle, and desperation grows. This economic hardship, in turn, fuels social unrest and violence. With fewer opportunities available, young people are more likely to be lured into crime. Gangs flourish in this environment of despair, their influence spreading like a virus. The Caribbean, a region already grappling with historical inequalities and the legacy of colonialism, is caught in a downward spiral. Breaking this cycle requires a holistic approach, one that addresses both the symptoms and the underlying causes of climate change and social insecurity. Section 8. A new way forward. The challenges facing the Caribbean are daunting but not insurmountable. There is still hope, a flickering flame that can be fanned into a beacon of change. But it requires a new way of thinking, a new way of doing things. First and foremost, the Caribbean needs to strengthen its political institutions, rooting out corruption and building trust in government. Leaders must be held accountable for their actions. Transparency and good governance must become the norm, not the exception. Secondly, the Caribbean must embrace regional cooperation. No island can face these challenges alone. By working together, sharing resources and coordinating their efforts, Caribbean nations can amplify their voices on the global stage and better advocate for their needs. Thirdly, the Caribbean must empower its people, particularly its youth, to become agents of change. Education is key. By investing in education and skills training, Caribbean nations can equip their young people with the tools they need to succeed in the 21st century. Section 9. Hope on the horizon. The Caribbean, a region of breathtaking beauty and indomitable spirit, stands at a crossroads. The path ahead is fraught with challenges: climate change, social inequality, political instability, but there is also hope. Across the islands, a new generation is rising, a generation that is more aware of the challenges facing their region and more determined to find solutions. They are demanding better governance, greater accountability, and a more sustainable future. They are harnessing the power of technology to connect with each other, to raise awareness, to mobilize for change. They are drawing on their rich cultural heritage, their traditions of resilience and resourcefulness to find innovative solutions to the problems they face. The Caribbean, the land of sun, sea, and endless sky, has weathered many storms in its long and tumultuous history. And while the challenges ahead are great, the spirit of its people is even greater. The journey will be long, the road will be hard, but there is hope on